Hi, welcome to Strange Wilderness. I'm Kevin Foster. Now, last time I talked about some of the more terrifying encounters I had, the more recent one being 3 years ago up in Maine. Well, shortly after that, I ended up going to Mount Desert Island to my son's house. He was staying with some roommates, and it was 4th of July weekend, and they had a huge 4th of July bonfire. And I'd been stewing on my encounters. The one that happened 20 years ago just kept coming back and haunting me. And of course, the one 3 years ago was like it had just happened. So as we were sitting around the campfire, somebody suggested we tell ghost stories. And I said, I've got something better. This really happened to me. And I went ahead and told my two encounters. And there was a pause, and I kind of expected people were going to start laughing and ridiculing me, but I was quite surprised to hear about a dozen different stories from individuals that had either had personal encounters or knew relatives or friends that had had encounters all throughout Maine. So this is why this episode is called Campfire Stories. Now, the first story came from a guy named Tom, and he told how he had an uncle that lived out in what is called the Medibumps area. Medibumps is probably northeast of Bangor, and it's a very heavily swamped area, and it has one of the larger lakes, which is actually called Medibumps Lake. So Tom went out there one day to help his uncle, who had been cutting wood all week long, to help stack and make some cords of wood for him. They spent the day out there stacking the wood. At the end of the day, he invited Tom to stay and have dinner, and they cooked steaks on the grill. And it began to get to be dusk, and they decided to sit out on the big deck that overlooked this swamp and have a few beers. And Tom said as it really started getting darker, all of a sudden this really loud, mournful howl came from behind the swamp. And immediately his uncle got up and ran to the deck and began howling back to this howl. And Tom was a little surprised, and he's like, "Gee, what are you doing?" And he's like, "Watch." He says, "I'm going to call this thing in." And Tom's like, "Well, what is it?" And he said, "Well, I call him the Howler." He said he's this really big, like 10-foot creature that comes around here, and he's like, "Don't worry about it." He says, "But we'll watch. I'll bring him in." So the howling continued back and forth between the two of them, and pretty soon Tom heard this like locomotion crashing coming through the woods. He said it sounded like an elephant coming through the woods, and it just kept getting closer and closer, and it would howl louder and louder as it got closer. So pretty soon, he said it was dark, and he said the porch lights were on, and at the perimeter of the porch lights, he could hear this creature crashing around in the darkness. And Tom was a little concerned. And I guess the uncle had a German Shepherd who got very scared and started whining. And his uncle said, "Oh yeah," he says, "my dog doesn't like this thing." And he got up and he let him in the house, and they continued to hear the crashing about. And then Tom said all of a sudden there were howls coming from behind this creature out in the woods. He said he heard like 3 different howls coming from 3 different areas. And he said all of a sudden, he said this creature just like let out this huge loud whoop. And he said it was so loud that he could like feel the vibrations in his chest. He said so this went on for like an hour, and then pretty soon the two of them decided to just head into the house. And Tom stayed overnight, he said, but he really had a very restful night. He couldn't sleep. He said he felt like this creature was there outside the window and watching him. And he said the next morning he ended up packing up and heading home. He said since that time he's gone and he's visited his uncle quite a few times. He says, but he's always said he made excuses not to spend the night there, and he hasn't really encountered the creature since then. But he said he's heard other stories from the same area. And anyway, this was quite the story. Now, another story came from this same area. This girl had, her parents had a house on Medibumps Lake, and it was actually a summer home, but one particular year they decided to have Thanksgiving at the house. And her mother, being the kind person that she was, had invited their neighbors over, which were two sisters from the Passamaquoddy tribe, and they were elderly, they were in their 80s, and she wasn't sure how the story got started, but these two sisters ended up telling a story about as they grew up, they were poor, and their family relied heavily on hunting and fishing. And their parents would often, during the summertime, go out fishing in a small boat. And the boat was too small for the four of them to go fishing, so the father would drop them off in the middle of the lake on this small island. Now, one of the sisters was saying that they often heard of this creature calling out in the woods towards dark. And funny thing was, they actually dubbed the creature the Howler too. And the story went that one particular day they had gotten dropped off and put on the island with their fishing gear, and the two girls spent the day fishing and exploring the island. And again, it was a small island. They said there was nothing on the island. There was no squirrels even on the island. It was pretty desolate. So they had spent the day fishing and ended up catching 4 fish. And they set the fish in the water on a stringer and put themselves on a big rock and sat there and waited for their parents to return to pick them up. They said it was getting towards dusk. And at that time, once again, they started hearing howling coming from across the lake, actually from behind them on the island, way off in the distance. And they just sat there waiting for their parents, and they didn't seem too concerned because they had heard the howling before. But they said that at one point they just heard this like rain water dripping. And the two of them turned around, and standing behind them were 2 enormous, hairy, brown creatures dripping wet. They said that it looked like they had just swam across the lake and they were standing behind them. Now the girls obviously got very nervous, and the creatures were grunting and looking at them, and one of the creatures just turned around and walked off towards where the fish were. They picked up the fish. They took the fish off the stringer. It took 2 fish off the stringer. And with the two fish, the creature walked over to the other one and handed him a fish. And the creature immediately placed the fish in its mouth. The other creature did the same thing. And the two of them, dripping wet, walked down to the edge of the pond and started getting in the water and just swimming across the lake. And the 2 girls stood there amazed. They had left the other 2 fish behind for the girls. And so they ended up waiting, and their parents eventually showed up, and they told them what had happened, and both parents were very concerned and told them if that ever happened again to just get in the water and swim, because apparently they had heard throughout the generations different stories passed down of women getting abducted by the creatures, and they had heard stories of the creatures actually being killed. So this, again, was another interesting campfire story. So the last episode, I showed you what I came across in the woods, a very bizarre and strange-looking stick structure. I definitely don't think it was man-made. They were the huge logs that were like the base of that structure. One of the limbs that was broken off was actually a boundary marker. It had the boundary marker tape wrapped around it. So in looking back at footage I had from 3 years ago, I actually came across these large boulder rock formations that were on a mountaintop across a mountain that I had just climbed. And these were huge boulders. Nobody could have, by themselves, or even 4 people, put these things together. So I'm going to show you those right now and do a little commentary on it. And I'll see you the next time on Strange Wilderness.
I don't know what it is.